Hello and welcome to the Daily Politics. Theresa May goes to Brussels, hoping to come back with a Brexit transition deal and a strongly worded statement on Russia. This summer's World Cup in Russia is like Hitler's 1936 Berlin Olympics, says Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson as he ramps up the rhetoric against Putin. We've got a better idea of what the UK's immigration policy will look like after Brexit, but will it satisfy those who want to leave the EU? And what qualities do you need to become Prime Minister? All that in the next hour. And with us for the whole of the programme today is the former Labour politician and chairman of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, Trevor Phillips. Welcome.
Good morning.
First of all today, 1 year on since the terrorist attack in Westminster, Parliament is remembering those who lost their lives, including PC Keith Palmer, who was killed protecting the Houses of Parliament. Last night, #LondonUnited was projected on Parliament by the Mayor's office. An event of reflection and commemoration is taking place in Westminster Hall at the moment. And earlier today, there was a minute's silence at the start of proceedings in the House of Commons.
Colleagues, we shall now observe a 1 minute silence in respectful memory of those who died a year ago today.
Members in the House of Commons there with the Speaker, John Bercow. I was in the Palace of Westminster that dreadful day, very close, in fact, to where PC Keith Palmer was stabbed to death. What were your memories of that time?
Well, I think with these things now, the reaction is the same. My first reaction is, I really hope it isn't what I think it is. I hope this is just an accident. And then secondly, a kind of incredulity, and then you think how ghastly this is. I think my feelings about it over the time have become, this is now part of our life, but I hope it never becomes normal, that we never think, oh, this is just part of the way that we live, because these incidents are appalling in their intent and their impact on people.
So. And it wasn't the only one, of course. It was a dreadful few weeks. So, in fact, your sentiment about and your fear that it might become sort of normalised because we had the Finsbury Park attack and London Bridge too. And lots is made of the fact that London has pulled together, people living in the capital, shows of solidarity. You would expect that, wouldn't you? I
would expect it, and it's part of what being a great city is about. But, I spent half my working life now in the United States, and there the equivalent is the endless stream of gun crimes and latterly bombings in Austin, Texas, where I was 2 weeks ago. And there is a sense that at each one it becomes less of an issue. And I hope that that never becomes one for us.
Let's leave it there. Now, Theresa May will be joining other EU leaders in Brussels this afternoon, and our reporter Adam Fleming is, as ever, on hand to talk us through it. First of all, Adam, let's start with that transition deal. Apparently it's going to be discussed at the end of a dinner. It's not going to play a sort of key role in things today in Brussels.
So what's going to happen today is that there's going to be a dinner on a whole load of subjects, and when Theresa May intervenes, she'll talk about Russia, but she'll also welcome the progress made in the Brexit negotiations this week. Do you remember the document I was holding up on Monday with all the green highlighting on it? But the main discussion about Brexit will happen amongst the 27, so without Britain, tomorrow morning, where what they will do is they will sign off on the guidelines for phase 2. The first paragraph of the guidelines is welcoming that progress made this week, including on the transition deal. But then that paragraph, that crucial paragraph, goes on to say nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. In other words, there is not true legal certainty on the transition period, or what the UK calls the implementation phase, until the whole Brexit treaty, of which the transition period is part, is signed off later in the year. Nevertheless, the Brits are very glad that there is language in there welcoming the transition, because it provides an extra layer of certainty for all those businesses that want to know what's going to happen.
OK, well, let's talk about Russia, because in light of the Salisbury attack, Theresa May is hoping for a strong, unified response from the EU to Russia. They have made a response, but she wants one directly condemning Putin. Will she get it?
I think she will. What we saw on Monday was a meeting of foreign ministers here. Boris Johnson was here, and they condemned the attack and said that they had strong solidarity with the UK. I think the language for that is going to be upgraded a bit to slightly harsher, tougher wording, which the Brits will be very happy about because that's what they've been asking for. Their rationale is that President Putin will see a statement from 28 of his neighbours acting en masse, standing shoulder to shoulder with Britain. What will not happen today and tonight at this dinner, and what the Brits are not asking for, is new measures against Russia. For example, EU sanctions or individual nations taking their own steps. The Brits are not asking for that. What they want is that strong statement of solidarity. And I think the reason that the Brits aren't asking for that is that they know they might not get any more tonight, because what most of the other 27 EU countries are waiting for is the official process at the OPCW, everyone's favourite acronym, the Chemical Weapons Watchdog, who are doing their own investigations into what happened. Once the OPCW have said for definite this is Russia, that's when I think things will step up a gear.
And Adam, the result of the competition to make the new post-Brexit British Blue Passport is awarded to France.
Yes, so a British company, De La Rue, which makes the passports now, was bidding for the contract to make the passports after 2019. They've lost out to a French company, meaning that this has already been dubbed Passport Gate. A few aspects to this. Apparently the procurement process isn't completely finished yet, so we have to wait for the final details about how this contract is actually going to look. There's lots of discussion about whether this French company will actually have a British subsidiary, and so that British passports will still be made on British soil. And Matt Hancock, the Culture Secretary, was on the Today programme this morning saying, just remember, one of the benefits of Brexit could be that once the UK is left, it will have more control over procurement rules and whether these competitions can be exclusively for British companies. Although having said that, if you read the guidelines that the EU leaders are going to sign off about phase 2, the future relationship talks tomorrow, public procurement's included in there. So maybe post-Brexit public procurement for the UK will look a little bit like pre-Brexit public procurement, and this could happen again in future.
I'll read through those guidelines again. Adam, thank you very much. And we're joined here in the studio by the Brexit-supporting Conservative MP, Theresa Villiers. Welcome back to the Daily Politics. First of all, the transition deal that Theresa May is hoping is going to be signed off. Is it a sellout to you and other Leave voters?
It's a compromise. I particularly regret that it's postponing the day when we take back control over our fisheries and our waters again. But the important question is what happens at the end of that implementation period. If we get the right new relationship with Europe, then that is the key issue for me. I can accept compromise in relation to the implementation period if the end result is proper respect for the referendum once we finish the implementation period.
Right, so it was worth the sacrifice for a greater or bigger prize. But do you think the government should have given way in the way they did over taking back something as fundamental as fishing rights and waters?
It was a difficult situation for them. I mean, I know from my conversations with businesses that they definitely wanted an implementation period. And I've actually argued for that from a relatively early stage. So I recognise if we were going to secure agreement on that, inevitably that did mean some compromises. And unfortunately, one of those appears to have been in relation to the fishing sector.
What about another one? The fact that EU citizens arriving during transition will have exactly the same rights as those who arrived before. Are you happy with that?
I can live with that. I mean, obviously, this was an area where the Prime Minister had, said that she wasn't going to allow that to happen. But if we are maintaining an implementation period where we get more or less the same rights as an existing member state, inevitably that means that we do probably take on almost all of the obligations as well. It's not a situation that I would have wanted in an ideal world. I would have wanted the benefits of leaving the EU to be gained at an earlier stage, but as long as we get them after December 2020, that is the important thing. That's the prize that we're seeking.
And can you live with the fact that Britain will have to abide by new laws introduced by the EU during transition without having a seat at the table?
Well, that is one of the most difficult points. I think there is, there obviously are attempts in the agreement that's been made for a joint committee to ensure that the two sides act fairly in relation to this implementation period, and that includes obviously a dialogue in relation to new laws being introduced. But that, for me, yes, is is another compromise with which I am uncomfortable.
Right. I mean, you've compromised a lot, it seems, like the government. You agree with the government's compromise. I mean, in what way does the transition deal fulfil the Leaver's vision, your vision, of a sovereign country freed from the constraints imposed by European politicians, laws and regulations?
It won't deliver that until after the end of the implementation period, I'm afraid.
Right, so we're leaving at the end of March 2019, but actually we will have left the EU in name only. That's correct, isn't it?
You could describe it like that. I'm not sure I would use exactly those words, but we have to make compromises if we're going to make a success of Brexit. And we also need to recognise that the country remains divided about this. So being able to, to listen to the concerns, different views, I think is very important if we're going to bridge the divisions that emerge.
Right. I mean, listening to Theresa Villiers, is it sensible to be pragmatic, to compromise, because actually the bigger prize is the free trade deal, or rather the trade deal and relationship we have with the EU after Brexit?
Well, I think Theresa and people who share her view can be rather cool about it right now, because actually what we're seeing is a lot of theatre. It's worth saying, by the way, that I spend the rest of my time on the continent, and Brexit isn't a big deal elsewhere. For them, this is a kind of, it's a bit of shadow boxing. What will happen, and I think Theresa's right about this, what matters is what happens at the end. And we're not really anywhere near getting on to the question of migration, how you deal with services, the trade issues. A lot of that will happen during the transition stroke implementation period. So my feeling is that we can get ourselves all worked up about it, but the truth of the matter is lots of it isn't really... battle hasn't been joined on some of the key things yet.
Right, do you accept that?
I think that's a reasonable analysis. The big battle is yet to come. What happens when we leave in name as well as in fact at the end of 2020?
Right, so this is the phony war so far?
It's an important negotiation, but it doesn't address the very big question, which is what is the nature of our future relationship with the European Union?
Well, let's talk about something symbolic, which are these passports. Do you welcome the decision to award this contract for the new British blue passport to a Franco-Dutch company?
Well, we don't know that that's the final decision yet.
Oh.
But because from what I understand, from what you and others have said, the procurement process isn't completed.
Right. But if it is and it goes to the Franco-Dutch company, as it looks at the moment, would you welcome it?
We have to take into account the interests of taxpayers in getting value for money for public spending. And so on the whole, whilst I think we definitely need reform of our public procurement rules to make them much simpler, the principle that the government and public authorities looks to different bids, including bids from different countries, is one that I can support. It brings overall economic benefits. I wish in this case that perhaps the passports could have been produced in the United Kingdom.
But I mean, isn't that what it's all about, though, Theresa Villiers? I mean, wasn't that the whole point of the Leave vision, or certainly part of it? I mean, Theresa May said delivering the best Brexit is about our national future, part of the way we improve the lives of people all over the country. Our best days lies ahead. And yet, there we go, handing the contract to a Franco-Dutch company, countries in the EU that we are leaving. What does that say?
Leaving the European Union is not about pulling up the drawbridge and not doing business with other countries. We have a very open economy, including the way our public procurement works, and we gain significant economic benefits as a result, including the fact that companies here can make passports for governments across the world.
Oh, we look forward to that announcement.
Yeah, but this is part of the Leaver case that you guys didn't really say anything very much about. We can go out and compete in the world, but we're going to lose some of the time. And this is a case of losing. De La Rue operate in many countries. I think they claim 40 countries. And I don't hear them going on about local preference when they make banknotes for Haiti or passports for somewhere else. Or, by the way, the $50 banknote for the country my family comes from, Guyana. I didn't hear them saying there should be a local Guyanese firm who do this. So I think, actually, they should stop whining. And if there's a future we should go into, I think, actually, Theresa, you should say, this is the way things are, and what we should really be doing is gearing up to compete more successfully rather than complaining when we come second.
Oh, you are absolutely right. This is all about being competitive and making sure that our businesses are producing absolutely the best bids, not only for UK public procurement, but for public procurement across the world.
Teresa, thank you for coming in. So the war of words between Russia and the UK is rumbling on. Theresa May wants a strongly worded statement, as we were discussing a little earlier, to come out of the EU Council meeting in Brussels. But Has says she's not looking for some big confrontation with Russia or regime change. But Boris Johnson's comments to a Commons committee yesterday have ratcheted up the rhetoric.
I think that your characterisation of what is going to happen in Moscow, in the World Cup, on all the venues, yes, I think the comparison with 1936 is certainly right, and I think it's an emetic prospect, frankly, for to think of Putin glorying in this sporting event.
Boris Johnson. Well, this morning, in reaction to the Foreign Secretary's comments, the Russian Consul General in Edinburgh, Andrei Pitsapov, has suggested that maybe it's time for him to go. Boris, that is. With me now is the foreign policy expert John Hulsman, who's just published a book called To Dare More Boldly, The Audacious Story of Political Risk. So he should know a thing or two about this current situation. So. Well, yes, that's why we've asked you on, so I've got my fingers crossed. What do you make of Boris Johnson's comments?
I'm bored with lazy historical analogies. There's more to the world than Munich and Vietnam.
Right. I mean,
the Russians are declining power. This is an aging gas station with nuclear weapons that has a GDP the size of the state of Texas. He's despicable. He can be managed. But if we compare him to Hitler, who was a rising power, we're going to get quite a lot wrong.
Right. Do you agree with that?
I do. I mean, I think, you know, when Hitler or Churchill enter the rhetoric, you know that the person speaking has run out of things to say.
Well, isn't there a law that says if you're having a heated debate about history, there is a certain tipping point at which the Nazis always seem to be raised?
Totally.
Conversation
absolutely.
killer.
But I think, I mean, it is sort of in bad taste and it's a bit vulgar. And I think there's a limit to how long Boris can get away with the undiplomatic language, which people find attractive, and when used in skillful hands, for example, I know this may seem odd, Trump, it can make things happen. But I think this is just a bit silly and really shouldn't have come up.
Well, perhaps we'll come back to the skilled comments of Trump that you're referring to, but of course he is meeting Kim Jong-un, isn't he, at some stage? I mean, do you think Theresa May is responding correctly to Putin? Just moving off Boris for a moment.
No, because again, I agree. The dichotomy between the Munich-like language and expelling 14 diplomats and their dog is laughable. If you really want to hurt the Russians, go after the money, follow the money. The oligarchs who live in London, who are tied to the Putin regime, if this is for real, you go after them, you do it quietly, you do it effectively, but the discrepancy between the rhetoric, which is apocalyptic, and the pipsqueak-like attitude is laughable, and that's what's wrong. They have to go together. The reason Trump worked was because he threatened with China using leverage, and everyone believed he might do it. And so the rhetoric matched what he might do, and then things move. If the rhetoric doesn't match the reality, someone looks laughable, and I'm afraid in this case it's Boris.
Well, and of course the government have complained about the mocking response from the Russian state. And in the last few minutes, the Russian ambassador to the UK, I think we've just heard for him, has said this. Alexander Yakovenko has been talking at a press conference about the Salisbury nerve agent attack.
The Foreign Office refused to share information on Sergei Skripal, stating that he is the British citizenship. Therefore, the British government has violated its obligations under the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations by denying consular access for the embassy to the Russian citizens. We continue to insist that the access and full information on the condition of our compatriots, whom nobody has seen since 4th of March, should be provided.
I mean, is this handing the Russians really some more ammunition to fire back at us?
Well, it is. Again, if you talk in these draconian terms, the Russians will then sound wounded, which is their playbook. Of course the Russians are involved. Of course the Russians did it. Of course they don't want Putin dating my daughter. But let's, if we're going
That's a relief. I'm glad we cleared that
up.
up.
See, the political risk is sorted there. But what we need to do is actually link what we want to do with things that can be done. Again, go after the oligarchs, and I'll take this seriously.
OK, so you do think the money, as other people have said too, is the leverage, is the way that you would actually hurt the regime.
The GDP is the size of the state of Texas. This is declining power.
Right, and that's the point. I mean, if Russia is so weak and its GDP is declining and is relatively small, why do they have so much power?
What they're doing, I mean, Putin has an 80% approval rating. This is great Russian nationalism. You go into his office, there's one picture there. It's of Peter the Great. Everybody understands that. I'm the strong czar bringing Russia back. And that is why he's popular domestically. Anything that makes him look that way plays to his strength. So the rest of the world condemns him is what he'd like.
Right, we've talked about Boris Johnson, but does it help when the Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has said he's condemning government warnings over the threat posed by Russia? Mr Corbyn said claims that Russia was now a strategic enemy were not helpful or sensible. Has he got a point?
You know, the thing about Jeremy is that I'm really glad he's not a footballer, because he'd be scoring own goals all the time. I mean, this is just bonkers. Putin is a bad guy. Putin is... what he's doing, and one explanation for his power, is that he breaks the rules. And his election last week has given him a bigger mandate to continue breaking the rules of international discourse. And the problem is, until we accept that the rules are changing because bad guys are changing them, which means that we've got to do what we say we're going to do, attack the money and all of that, then actually he isn't at all disturbed by any of this.
Right. But then what does the British government do next? They're going to get probably this communique from the EU, which will be strongly worded, the government hopes, and will say Putin did it. We can't find another explanation for who was behind that attack. But then he's congratulated on his re-election by Jean-Claude Juncker, who's accused of being tone deaf, and Trump congratulates him too. Yeah. I mean, does that matter, or is it important actually in terms of the ego of Vladimir Putin?
I think it's more important that one of Putin's narratives, again, beyond being the brave man standing up for Russian rights against a world against him, is how weak and divided his enemies are. And so when we don't speak coherently in the same way, it does look very, very bad indeed. And the EU is an example. It's a Tower of Babel. We have the Italians now, two parties who would want to, get rid of sanctions on Russia. We have other countries that would want to keep them forever. That dichotomy is exactly him going through threading the needle and getting what he wants, and that's the problem.
Right, and is this the return of a new Cold War?
No, again, a Cold War was between superpowers. A wounded bear, which is what Russia is dangerous. There is no doubt Russia can be dangerous. But to pretend that these are two great superpowers fighting each other just doesn't explain what's going on here. Follow the money, use the money to grind the guy down. The GDP is the size of the state of Texas. In 2050, there'll be 10% fewer Russians than there are now. This is a weak power, not a strong power.
Well, the Russian ambassador to London has said Boris Johnson's comparison of World Cup to Nazi Olympics is totally irresponsible. I think we can listen to that. Let's see. No?
The British government is free to make a decision about its participation in the World Cup. But nobody has the right to insult the Russian people who defeated Nazism and lost more than 25 million people by comparing our country to Nazi Germany. That goes beyond the common sense, and we do not think British war veterans, including those of the Arctic convoys, would share this opinion.
Just very briefly, yes or no, should we boycott the World Cup?
No. By the way, forget, 1936 Olympics was a bad time for Hitler because Jesse Owens, black athlete, caned everybody. So it's not a really good precedent for Putin.
Right. Should we boycott it?
No, let's be serious.
OK. Thanks very much for coming in. Now, after days of negative headlines for the internet giant, Facebook's founder Mark Zuckerberg has broken his silence over the Cambridge Analytica story and whether users' personal data was exploited in political campaigns.
This isn't rocket science, right? I mean, there's a lot of hard work that we need to do to make it harder for nation states like Russia to do election interference, to make it so that trolls and other folks can't spread fake news. But we can get in front of this. And we have a responsibility to do this, not only for the 2018 midterms in the US, which are going to be a huge deal this year, and that's just a huge focus of us, but there's a big election in India this year, there's a big election in Brazil, there are big elections around the world.
Mark Zuckerberg, and our point woman on this story, the BBC's technology reporter Zoe Kleinman, joins us now from Southampton. Zoe, does the apology go far enough?
A lot of people don't think it does. When he first put his Facebook post up last night, everyone was sort of saying, well, you know, you don't sound particularly sorry at all. He sort of said, yes, it's my responsibility, and yes, I created the platform, and, you know, I'm sorry if something's gone wrong. But he wasn't particularly forthcoming or emotional about it.
Right. What about, though, the points on regulation? He did seem to accept that regulation, whatever form it takes, was necessary.
Facebook has hit this situation now where it's got much bigger than I think it ever expected to be, and it's got to accept that it's a publisher, it's publishing content, and that makes it very powerful, but it also makes it subject to very strict regulation, just like other communications channels. And I think he recognises that it's time, and also I think he wants the regulation in place to avoid these sort of situations where we're going back in time, looking at something that's happened historically and trying to fix it, you know, in real time after the event. Whereas if regulation was there, it would be much clearer from now on what Facebook cannot and cannot do with people's data. But of course, that might also end up biting them in the wallet, because it might restrict the advertising opportunities that the firm is currently able to offer.
Right. Do you think it will mean a change to their business model?
Not straight away, no, I don't. I mean, I think Facebook is a free product, and if you are using that product for free, then that means you are the product and your data has that value. What I think it's going to have to do is to really hammer that home. You know, it's been hidden in the T's and C's for years, but people haven't really realised it. It's also, I think, going to have to be much more relaxed about letting people opt out of how their data is used, and that is possibly going to lead to it becoming a slightly smaller platform in terms of it being attractive for advertisers.
I mean, the hashtag delete Facebook, has that garnered much support? I mean, I haven't deleted my Facebook account, it has to be said.
Do you know, that's an interesting thing. So many people have seen it and then said, yeah, but I haven't done it. So we haven't really seen that massive footfall. I think it had about 10,000 retweets within the first couple of hours, which is quite a lot.
Yes.
But we certainly haven't seen that footfall in the millions.
Right, but you may see people, like me, looking at the terms and conditions and perhaps resetting what you put on your Facebook account.
Yeah, and one of the things Mark Zuckerberg has said is that that's going to become a much more obvious tab at the top of the newsfeed shortly, I imagine. So you'll probably see a reminder to go in and have a look. The other thing you can do, of course, it's very easy to do. If you go into the general settings, you can download a copy of the data that Facebook has on you, and you can have a look and see exactly what it's been keeping. That might include the contacts in your phone book. It might include all of your private messages. Whatever you've given it access to over the years will all be there, and you can see for yourself what it has.
Gulp. Zoe, thank you very much for joining us. What's this done, do you think, in terms of democracy? Has our democracy been compromised by this, Trevor?
Personally, I don't think so. I mean, you know, politicians of all stamps have used the latest methods to try and persuade people to try and frame issues in a particular way. I don't myself think that's the big issue here. I think Mark Zuckerberg, not personally worried, I mean, he's only down to his last $68 billion this week.
Yeah.
But I think what he's more worried about is that big tech starts to look like the big banks did 7 or 8 years ago. And two things then happen. Facebook is not going to get deleted.
No, a British group of advertisers, of course, have threatened to stop using the platform. Do you think that's just virtue signalling?
I think it's virtue signalling. I don't think most people are going to do exactly what you did, look at it and go, well, why bother? I think what he is more worried about is this, that if there's a mood for greater public regulation, what they'll do is bound up the lawmakers on surface regulations. What I think Facebook would be really worried about is if law changed to put the value of that data in the consumer's hands.
Yeah, but isn't that what could happen? That we would be in charge of who we allow to see our data?
It's conceivable, but I think what Facebook will do tactically is to find ways of heading that off at the pass, because that would really change things dramatically if we had the value. In the way we do with our store cards, you get advantages. Loyalty cards.
Yeah.
If Facebook were in that situation, they would have to change their business model completely. And that's why I think you've got this announcement yesterday.
Just to return to the issue of politics and democracy, Cambridge Analytica and the story that has been exposed this week. How difficult is it for governments who may have used their services in terms of political campaigns and digging dirt on opponents?
Look, my view about this is that the genie's out of the bottle. And frankly, there's a lot of focus on Cambridge Analytica, and they clearly, in my view, have done something at least unethical, if not unlawful, in the way this data has been used. But the truth of the matter is, nobody objected to it when Blue State Digital did something rather similar for the Obama campaign. The point is, we now have these new tools, and one of the difficulties we have in politics is that lawmakers are really totally ill-equipped to deal with this. Most members of Parliament, and by the way, Congress, don't really understand it. I looked up this morning, there are fewer than 30 members of Parliament out of 650 who have a science background. I mean, one of the big problems here is the political sphere doesn't really understand it, and the lawyers who dominate Parliament think that the way you'll solve this is to pass a law. They will get hammered.
All right, all those lawyers in the House of Commons. Fish seem to have captured all the headlines, but does the EU's draft withdrawal agreement also point to a climb down on EU immigration, with the prospect of EU citizens who arrived during the transition period having the same rights as those who came before? Confused? Well, here's Emma Vardy with a helpful guide to what our immigration policy might look like after Brexit.
The freedom for EU citizens to come and live in the UK was always one of the most fiercely debated aspects of Brexit. And the rules we're proposing to set in future have been a key part of the negotiations. So with the help of the great map here at the National Maritime Museum, here's how it's expected to work. That key date is the 29th of March 2019, when we leave the EU. And EU citizens who've been living in the UK for 5 years by that date will be able to apply for settled status, and they'll be able to go on to apply to become British citizens. Those arriving in the UK after Britain leaves the EU will have to register with the authorities if they want to stay for longer than 3 months. For around 2 years after Brexit, during the transition period, EU citizens who arrive in the UK will also be able to apply for settled status once they've been here for 5 years. It means the free movement of people is effectively set to continue during that 2-year period after we leave the EU. But how will the rules change in future if British citizens want to visit Europe? The UK government wants to keep visa-free travel for EU citizens to the UK after Brexit, and is hoping this will be reciprocated. That would mean UK citizens will still be able to visit EU countries for short periods without having to get official permission to travel. But it's all subject to agreement. What about after the Brexit transition period ends? Britain's future immigration system with the rest of the world may depend on the types of trade deals that Britain negotiates. Any trade deals with countries outside the EU may also come with demands to increase the availability of visas for citizens of that country. Currently, we don't know what form this will take, but the Home Office says it will address people's concerns about the impact of unrestricted immigration. The way our immigration rules change in future is likely to affect many sectors of the economy, and is also likely to play a big part in the way the impact of Brexit is viewed in years to come.
Emma Vardy reporting that. Well, watching that was the former UKIP Deputy Chair, Suzanne Evans, and Aaron Bastani, who co-founded Novara Media and is close to Jeremy Corbyn. Welcome to both of you. Suzanne Evans, all right, we know now that freedom of movement will continue during that transition period. Is that a betrayal?
I think it's a semi-betrayal. I'm really pleased that we now have a date, at least, when the transition period is going to end, because that was always the fear, that this period seemed to go on indefinitely. I think it's quite interesting, though, that it's the EU that's put down that marker rather than us.
Yeah, slightly shorter of 2 years.
Yeah, we should have started saying there's a backstop right here from the word go. So yes, I mean, we have a government that says it wants to reduce net migration to the tens of thousands. That's clearly not going to happen now within the next 3 years. We know that immigration was a major factor in the Leave vote. And my concern is that in this 2-year period, after we've supposedly left the EU, anything could happen. What if there's another Eurozone crisis? What if unemployment gets even higher, particularly among younger people in the Eurozone? We could see a huge influx of people into this country, which our public services simply can't cope with. So while in the sense I'm very pleased that we now do have an end date, and let's for goodness sake hope this is finally the end date and this transition doesn't go on ad infinitum. But yeah, it's not what we voted for.
Right. I mean, are you welcoming the idea that freedom of movement continues during the transition?
I mean, not really. I just think the whole thing's very ambiguous. We voted, I think the referendum question was, 13, 14 words? We voted on leaving the European Union. We never voted on leaving the single market, whether we could be in the EEA, whatnot. Now, I'm not making that point today, but in terms of what's been consented to, it's quite limited. And so, of course, there was going to be a little bit of a delay, a bit of hesitation about precisely what Brexit meant, which more or less I think we're now finding out.
But are you happy about freedom of movement continuing?
I mean, I'm ambivalent about it. I'm a socialist. I care more about the free movement of capital than of people. I think if you have freedom of movement of people and of capital, it only means the underdevelopment of poorer countries. It means wealthier countries get even wealthier. So freedom of movement of people, it's a big thing for the left, but also we need to be talking about freedom of movement of capital, things like capital controls.
Right, but we're talking about immigration here. And beyond the transition period, are you happy, as we've heard so many times from politicians, that the UK is going to take back control of its borders, and that will mean visas? It will not mean free movement in the way we know it now.
Well, we presently don't have free movement, obviously, for people not coming from the European Union. That's merely going to be extended. And when there are elements of the left that they say, you know, this is terrible, we want...
What do you say?
Well, actually, I was a rare beast. I was a Lexiter. And I changed my mind on the basis that I thought that Juncker would make an example of us. We could have it very bad after leaving the EU, and that the question wasn't clear enough in regards to things like the EEA, in regards to the ECJ.
So you voted Brexit?
I voted Remain.
Right, OK, so you voted Remain.
But I can see the merits of leaving, absolutely.
Right, OK. I mean, in terms of taking back control, this phrase that keeps being used, there is also the option, of course, of the UK allowing more people to come from outside the EU, which they've been able to do if they wanted to. Would that be a good thing?
Well, I think, as Aaron said, you know, it's one of the grotesque things for me, and I think for UKIP and for any leaver, really, about the current system, is that we had an open door to anyone coming in from continental Europe and absolutely closed doors to people coming in from anywhere else in the world, which was grotesquely unfair.
Right. So would you like to see more people coming from outside
Well,
the
not
EU?
necessarily more, but I think it's about quality rather than quantity, isn't it? And that's the whole point about having a controlled migration system. You can choose who you let in through your front door, just as you would in your own house. So if we need engineers, if we need scientists, if we need nurses, whatever we need, we take those skills that we need, and not just anybody who just decides one day that they want to come to Britain and doesn't have a job to go to, is going to be on benefits and so on and so forth.
I mean, it hasn't been resolved, has it, this issue, really, on immigration?
Not at all. And it's really peculiar to be sitting here listening to Suzanne Aaron. I'm wondering if the last thing you said, Suzanne, means that actually what you really want is fewer Portuguese and, you know, more people from India and Pakistan. But the more general point is, this is peculiar because it feels to me like both of colleagues here are saying, stop the world, let's get off. I mean, actually, we need immigration because of our business. We need people to work. But this idea that somehow you can just stop it feels like a kind of siege economy.
I mean, you're ventriloquising what I'm saying. I've not ever said stop the world. What I'm saying is...
Neither.
We could, for instance, I would like to see us triple the number of asylum applicants. That's probably a line that separates Suzanne and I, so we don't agree on that, for instance.
I'm not sure, actually. I think there's an issue with asylum. I think the fact that we have mass uncontrolled immigration does limit the amount of places we can give to genuine asylum seekers.
I would want to triple that.
That's also an issue.
So on a per capita basis, we're on par with the European Union. At present, that's not the case. And I fundamentally don't see why we should discriminate between people coming from the global north and the global south. I mean, that's just a basic principle of equality under the law for me.
Do you think visas, a system of visas, I mean, we have a point system anyway, but do you think sort of taking that a step further is going to somehow negatively, even more negatively affect people from the poorer parts of the world than it does from the richer?
I don't think so particularly. I don't think it will make that much of a difference. My main point is that I think we need to have, I agree, we need to have a control system, but it has to be a fair system, and it has to be a system that serves our economy and our needs. And by the way, I think, as being shown elsewhere, this is an issue across Europe. And by the way, the other 27 countries are not united on this. Hungary, Poland, so on have a rather different view to the Germans and the French. But the key point, I think, is that I think we need to stop getting too obsessed by numbers. Because the thing that really, I think, drove the Leave vote was less than numbers, but the issue of integration and cultural relationships.
On that point,
and I think we should spend a bit more time and energy on that question.
All right. Do you think that that is still an issue? Just briefly, we haven't got much time. This issue of poor integration. Sajid Javid said he's going to tackle the root causes of integration. Will continued EU immigration inflame any of those tensions?
It's a huge issue. It is about numbers because it is about people using public services. I don't think you can entirely take numbers out of the equation. But I think part of the reason...
But the Germans have are solving that by putting vast amounts of money in integration. 20 billion
Germany's
euros this year.
a much bigger country as well. And it's quite interesting. If you go to Germany, you'll see that most of their immigrants are from Europe as opposed to elsewhere in the world. But the thing is, I think integration is a massive issue. And part of the reason, I think, why immigration has got such a bad name in certain quarters, it's not because of immigrants, it's because of the inability to integrate and the way in which our culture is seen to be changing. And that scares people.
Suzanne and Aaron, thank you very much. And for more reporting and analysis of Brexit, check out the BBC News website if you haven't already. That's bbc.co.uk/Brexit. Now, yesterday, Theresa May was under attack from Jeremy Corbyn about the Conservatives' record in local government. The Prime Minister was able to boast that a number of Labour councillors have recently defected to the Tories. One of them is Chris Barron, and he joins us now from Nottingham. Chris, why have you defected?
After 30 years or more of being in the Labour Party and nearly 26 years an elected member, eventually things build up and you think, well, this isn't my type of politics. I've not changed my views on politics and local issues in particular. It's the Labour Party that has changed, and nobody should be afraid of change. Everybody wants change for the better. Unfortunately, this is change for the worse.
Right. I mean, you were suspended in 2016 for poor attendance of council meetings. Did that form the basis of your decision to defect?
Not at all. Unfortunately, on that suspension, it says for non-attendance of council meetings. I had my mother. There was personal reasons why I didn't attend, and also working very long hours at work. But this wasn't an issue to me. Because my priority should have been, as it was, with the family. And I can give you an example. My colleague Lee, who also came across to the Conservatives a couple of days ago, an example of how Ashford Labour Group in particular has been infiltrated by others is that for a budget meeting, we only had 12 members there. For Lee's suspension meeting, there was 27.
Right, who's infiltrated?
Of course, it's the supporters of Momentum that have infiltrated the Ashford Labour Group. And I'll be perfectly honest, from the emails that I've received in the last couple of days from other Labour members in other authorities, and they're saying it's being replicated there as well within their Labour groups.
Right.
Something's wrong. Members
of Momentum have accused you of being a Tory, and I suppose now you are, so they've been proved right all along.
That's correct.
OK, so they've got a point then. I mean, how does it feel, as you say, to have left the party you've been a member of for 30 years and literally gone to the opposite side?
It's very hard, but I feel that the Conservatives are more my way of thinking, and in fact is mainstream politics. And it's so important to have mainstream. Nobody wants far left or far right. I say nobody. I mean most people. They like to have the mainstream, and there's stability there. If you go in either sharp directions, either side, often leads to chaos.
Right.
And of course, the way we are now, well, the way the Labour Party are now, I think is leading to that chaos side.
Except, of course, they've swelled their membership numbers hugely, and they're a sort of mass party that any other political party in this country is totally envious of. I mean, some Labour MPs, though, are worried about deselection, despite the fact that the leadership says that that is not a policy of theirs. Do you think one of the nearby MPs, Gloria De Piero, is at risk of deselection?
Oh, without a shadow of a doubt. Don't forget, Gloria was one of the two, which is Ashfield and Sherwood, were parachuted in, not in this election, the one prior to it. They were both parachuted in, both all-women shortlists. A lot of people were upset about that at the time. The Sherwood one, which was a 7,000 plus majority, We lost Sherwood, it was paddy tipping, and of course Gloria De Piero was parachuted in and substantially won.
Okay.
But she only just got in last time by, I'm going to say, early 400 votes or something like that.
Well, I don't know, so I can't verify if that's correct or not. But Chris Barron, thank you for joining us, because we're joined now from Salford by the Shadow Communities Secretary, Andrew Gwynn, who has been launching Labour's local elections campaign this morning. Welcome to the programme, Andrew. So you've launched your local election campaign, a rather auspicious start, though, isn't it, with at least 2, if not more, councillors defecting to the Tories?
Well, of course, you have movements like this all the time, Joe. And I'm very genuinely sorry that Chris feels that he's no longer part of the Labour family, because actually local government, and the message we will be taking out as part of this local election campaign, local government is the bedrock of how we improve our local communities, how we ensure that we live in a fairer, more decent, more equal society. And I believe that the Labour message of ensuring that we have properly funded public services after 8 years of Tory austerity is really starting to resonate in so many parts of the country.
But what do you say to a foot soldier like Chris Barron, who's been in the party for 30 years, saying that the Tories are now mainstream politics? They offer stability. The extremes, the Labour Party, supported by Momentum, he said, who have infiltrated his local party, are not worthy of his support.
Joe, there's nothing mainstream about 50% cuts to council budgets.
So he's wrong.
There's nothing mainstream about Sure Start centres being closed. There's nothing mainstream about 1 million elderly people not being able to get the social care packages that they need. We need a Labour government working alongside Labour councils to ensure that our public services are properly financed and funded. And that's what the Labour Party is all about, and that's the message we will be taking out to the doorsteps ahead of the elections on May the 3rd.
People put their faith in Chris and one of his colleagues in the local area, and they've let their voters down by defecting, haven't they?
Well, Chris has to justify his own movements to another party, to the party that has...
Well, he blames you. He blames Labour.
Well, that has a party that has presided over the decimation of local services. We are talking about massive cuts. The Local Government Association, Tory-controlled, incidentally, the Local Government Association is saying that in the decade to 2020, there will be a funding gap for our crucial, vital public services of £5.8 billion. That happened on the Conservatives' watch. Now, Chris has to justify the reasons why he thinks those cuts are right. I don't think those cuts are right. I think we need to be making sure that we reinvest in our public services.
And so you're committed to reinvesting. You say that local services have been decimated. I mean, this is extremely serious in the way that you've articulated. As you say, you've got the support of the Local Government Association. £5.8 billion been taken out. Why is the Labour manifesto only promising an extra £1.5 billion a year? That's not going to help restore the services that have been decimated by you.
But of course, you've been very selective
Tories,
there.
Sorry.
What we have committed to in the Labour manifesto is £1.5 billion for general council services this year. We've also committed to £8 billion on adult social care. At the autumn budget,
over a period of how long?
Well, over the period of the next Parliament.
Right, so that's about £2 billion a year.
But Joe, this is all adding up.
Not to £5.8 billion, it doesn't.
We've also committed for the £2 billion that the Local Government Association says our children's services need, and we pressed this in a vote in the autumn budget in November when the Tories gave a £5 billion tax giveaway to the banks. We think those are the wrong priorities, and we would also reinvest £500 million back in early years, reinventing Sure Start, that was so critical to ensuring that those children and those families got the support that they needed to give them the best possible start in life.
Just stay there a moment. Trevor, does Andrew have your support in these local elections?
Oh, well, I'm not ambiguous about this at all. I'm a Labour supporter, I'm a Labour member, and will continue to be. I think Chris is wrong to leave. But what I would say is that if Labour is going to win, it's got to have a message that is a bit bigger than Tories are bad.
Right. I mean, what do you say? Because everything you've said in this interview has been about how awful the Conservatives are, rightly or wrongly, and all about the cuts and the decimation of local services. Where's the bright optimism? Where's the future under Labour?
Well, the bright optimism is that vision of hope, that vision of opportunity, that vision that Britain does not have to be like this,
What are the policy measures behind that?
Well, I've just told you, we're reinvesting in our public services. We are making sure that our children get the best start in life that we can provide them. We're ensuring that our communities become stronger again. We're ensuring that our elderly can grow old with dignity and with appropriate care.
All right,
and I
Andrew.
actually think when you put that together, Joe, that is a real positive vision for the future.
And are you convinced you're going to take Westminster Council?
Well, look, I'm not going to speculate before a single vote's been counted.
No, all right,
we are expecting good election results on the 3rd of May, but beyond that, let's wait and see.
Andrew Gwynn, thank you.
Thank you.
Now, earlier in the week, we heard from the mother of 6-year-old Alfie Dingley on the day she presented a petition to Number 10 calling for her son to be granted a special licence to use medical cannabis. Alfie, who suffers from epilepsy, was regularly rushed to hospital in an ambulance before his parents took him to Holland to be treated with cannabis oil. That wasn't an option available to them here in the UK, where cannabis of all kinds is illegal. So on Tuesday's programme, Alfie's mother told us what difference the drug had made.
Once he was put on the THC as well as the CBD oil, he had 1 seizure a month. He had 1 dose of steroids a month. He had a happy life. He noticed his sister. He played with her. We had family days together, which were normal, and we hadn't had that for a long, long time, and it was just a miracle for us. And we wanted to replicate that in the UK with our family and with our friends and with our jobs, and try to get back to some sort of normality.
Alfie's mum there, our reporter Greg Dawson, to whom she was talking, can bring us up to date with the story. What's happened?
Well, since they took that petition to Downing Street, the family were actually invited inside Number 10, where they met with the policing minister, Nick Hurd, and then, to their surprise, Theresa May walked in and said she also wanted to meet Alfie and the family.
Oh, right.
And she told them that she was working very hard to find a solution. Now, it appears, and the family are certainly under this impression, that solution could be that a medical licence will be issued on compassionate grounds. Now, the family have been told all of this would be subject to a medical professional submitting an application on Alfie's behalf. But again, the family are under the impression that the Home Office would work constructively with them on that application. So no guarantees, but they're certainly feeling a lot more hopeful than they were at the beginning of the week.
Right, but it does sound like some success and progress has been made.
Yeah, I spoke to the Home Office this morning to see what they had to say, and they again emphasised that they have every sympathy with Alfie and the condition that he's living with, but any solutions would need to be led by senior clinicians, and that would need to be backed with medical evidence. Now, when I put it to them that they were considering the idea of a licence based on compassionate grounds, they didn't deny it, but they did say that this would be an exception because of the exceptional circumstances that he's the only person in the UK living with this condition.
Right, will you keep us in touch? And obviously you'll stay in contact with the family when we know something even more concrete. Thanks, Greg. Now, most commentators think Theresa May won't be allowed to fight another election, and there are any number of runners and riders on the Conservative benches. But what does it take to become Prime Minister, and has Jeremy Corbyn got what it takes? In a moment, we'll be talking to someone who's written a book about just that. First, though, here's Elizabeth Glinker with the Daily Politics top 5 tips for becoming and staying PM.
Hello and welcome to the Daily Politics top 5 tips for becoming and staying Prime Minister.
Number 1, rising to the occasion. When the going gets tough, the toughs get going.
Knowing what to say and how to say it at a time of national crisis, well, that's a sure route to success.
C'est contre la tyrannie, toute réforme.
Fluffing your lines or misjudging the mood, well, that can spell the end.
I do apologise if I've said anything that has been hurtful, and I will apologise to her personally.
Number 2, ambition. Or should that read hunger for power?
Mr. Blair, good morning. Are you confident today?
You might think it goes without saying, but however much you pretend it's all a bit of a surprise, you've actually got to really want it. Not only do you have to fight your political opponents, but the most vicious attacks can often be from your own side.
Number 3, be different. At least from the last guy. Do you think it makes a difference?
Where there is doubt, may we bring faith, and where there is despair, may we bring hope.
Eccentricity is not necessarily an advantage, but just the very fact of being something else when what's come before has been so distinctive can be an advantage. And if the public mood is ready for change, then you can be the change.
Number 4, you've got to be a people person.
And it's not just understanding the hopes and dreams of voters, but also being a good communicator, the kind of person who can convince others to follow. Oh, and not offending the Queen.
And finally, lucky number 5. You can't really control it, but you definitely need it.
Success or failure can depend on the smallest of margins. And as one British Prime Minister famously opined, it's events, dear boy, events. So if you can possibly help it, do be lucky.
Elizabeth Glinker there with the top tips. Well, joining me to share his own top tips for the power hungry, and of course Trevor Phillips too, is the author and former sketch writer Andrew Jimpson, holding his book there, Prime Ministers. Well, as if by great symmetry you're here to talk exactly on that subject. Who's been the most successful Prime Minister?
Disraeli, the only one to be the object of a posthumous cult, and he started out with the great disadvantage of being a practising Jew, and Jews were not allowed to become MPs until 1858. Luckily, his father fell out with the synagogue and they converted to the Church of England when Disraeli was only 12 years old. But he still had a lot of difficulties to overcome.
Right. What about the worst?
Oh, probably Lord Goderich. Who his problem
that household name.
His problem was that he kept on bursting into tears. He couldn't really.
Really?
Yeah.
I can share that quality.
Yes.
What about for you? Best one?
Oh, best Prime Minister? Probably Macmillan, if Disraeli's already taken.
Oh, God.
OK, all right. Well, and what about luck? Does luck have a big role to play?
Yeah, but you have to keep going through bad luck. But of course, I mean, as Macmillan actually said to Churchill, it took Hitler to make you Prime Minister and me an Under-Secretary. The Tory party would do neither. The Tory party did not like Churchill.
By the way, Macmillan not for political reasons, because political reasons it would be Attlee for me. But
Yes.
Macmillan had two great things that the British love. One, able to fake sincerity. Secondly, the capacity to look like you're completely used to being in charge.
Yes.
And Macmillan looked like a man who had always been in charge. His family's always been in charge. So we
wasn't
liked
true,
him.
in fact. He was a businessman. But
I know, but
yes.
he was able to project the idea that I'm completely used to handling things. Leave it to me. And we love that.
Stay calm, as they say. One of the qualities that you've put down in your book is about the ability to perform a U-turn. Is that really a sign of success?
I think you have to have the fortitude to be weak as Prime Minister, and you cannot tell.
You can only do that if you're strong in the first place.
You're not a dictator, no. This is a very important thing. On average, these people last 5.5 years in the job, and they cannot. Free people cannot be ordered around. And that is very, very important. And if you get something wrong, I mean, that is why Margaret Thatcher had to go, because she wouldn't do a U-turn on the poll tax. She didn't realise that it was bitterly resented and regarded as totally unfair. And by that stage, she'd been in for so long that she didn't realise she got to aim off on that.
But that U-turn on the social care policy during the election campaign.
Yes, well, I said the ability to conduct a U-turn.
I see. Not the execution.
I mean, insisting that nothing had changed was almost the worst of both worlds, wasn't it?
Right, and
she didn't admit that things had.
She's under pressure now, of course, not just over Brexit, but on
Yes.
Russia. Can she meet all the criteria that you might set for a Prime Minister to be successful there?
Not a hope. But I think she's doing better because, as someone said, she's rather like David Beckham. She's good at set pieces where she can think about it and then, take a good free kick or whatever it is.
Right.
She thought about this thing in Salisbury for quite a while and worked out what she's going to do, rather as she did when she was Home Secretary. She's good at that.
Right.
And certainly not put under great pressure by the opposition.
Yeah, do you agree with that?
Yeah, full disclosure, I worked with Theresa May for 3 years when I was chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission. I like her very much. I think she is actually sincere, works incredibly hard, but she doesn't project the sense of effortless command that Britain likes.
Well, let me try and give you a little bit effortless command. Be quiet. It's the end of the show. That's it for today. Thank you for being my guest of the day. Bye.
Today, Britain stands at a fork in its crossroads. Now we've got our country back. What actually is it? The best way to find out where we're heading It's to look behind us at some of the biggest faces in British history and to ask other people's faces about them.
How did Sir Walter Raleigh invent the potato?
So join me, Philomena Cunk, as I take you right up the history of the United Britain of Great Kingdom. Cunk on Britain!
Starts Tuesday.